Kansas City police have solved a 31-year-old murder case. Fawn Cox was just 16 years old, and tonight we know the person responsible for her rape and murder was her own cousin.
It's a case that our investigative department has been following every step of the way. Investigative reporter Angie Racono joins us live now from police headquarters. So Angie, what ultimately solved this case?
DNA, and they've had DNA for 3 decades, but they never got a match in the federal database, which is called CODIS.
July 26, 1989, Kansas City, Missouri. It's late. Most of the city is asleep. The kind of deep summer sleep where air conditioners hum and the night feels endless and nothing, absolutely nothing, feels threatening. On East 9th Street near Van Brunt Boulevard, a family has gone to bed just like any other night. The Cox family. Working class, close-knit. The kind of family where the kids look out for each other, where dinner is loud, where everyone knows everyone else's business. A normal family on a normal street in a city that, on this particular night, has no idea what is about to happen inside one of its homes. Earlier that evening, 16-year-old Fawn Marie Cox had finished her shift at Worlds of Fun, Kansas City's big amusement park. She'd been on her feet all day, standing behind a register selling ride tickets in the summer heat. When the shift ended, her mother Beverly came to pick her up, along with her younger sister. They drove home together. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Fawn was tired. She had another shift the next morning, and she needed rest. So she went straight to bed. That was the last time anyone in the family saw her alive. Sometime during the night, while her family slept downstairs, while the air conditioners masked every sound, someone climbed up to the second floor of that house. They broke through Fawn's bedroom window. They entered her room, and they took her life. She was 16 years old. The next morning, Beverly Cox went to Fawn's room when her alarm clock kept going off and wouldn't stop. She walked in and tried to shake her daughter awake. She kept shaking. Fawn wasn't sleeping. Felisa Cox, Fawn's sister, was the one who found her too. Years later, she would describe that moment in just a few words. "I went over to shake her," she said. "Come on, get up." But she had been gone for a while. Gone for a while. Think about what those words mean. The family had been in the same house, sleeping, going about the night, and right above them, Fawn was already gone, and no one heard a thing. When investigators arrived at the scene, they began piecing together what had happened. Someone had entered through the upstairs window. Fawn had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The family's air conditioning units had been running all night. And that matters, because it meant that even if there was any sound, any struggle, any cry, it was swallowed whole by that hum. Felisa Cox later remembered one thing from that night. The family dog had been agitated, restless, unusual. But the dog was pregnant, and everyone brushed it off. They figured the dog was just uncomfortable. That dog knew something was wrong. From the very beginning, detectives believed something important. Fawn's killer was someone who knew her. Not a random intruder stumbling onto an unknown house in the dark. Someone who knew the layout. Someone who knew how to get into the backyard, knew which window led to Fawn's room, knew that the second floor could be reached. Years later, KCPD Sergeant Ben Caldwell would say it plainly. To pick that home and that window to come in undetected and leave undetected makes sense, since the suspect knew Fawn. The investigators were right about that. They just had no idea how right. In those first days, police launched a full investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed neighbors. They spoke to friends, family, anyone who might know something. Crime Stoppers posted a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. DNA evidence was collected from the crime scene, a major step for 1989 when forensic DNA analysis was still in its earliest days. The case was heating up, and investigators thought they were close. They weren't. Within weeks of Fawn Cox's murder, Kansas City police had their first suspects. 3 young men, teenagers, 2 of them juveniles, were arrested and charged with her murder. On the surface, it looked like the case might be close to being resolved. Police had developed a theory, a botched robbery. The idea was that someone had broken in to steal from the house, and things had escalated. But there was a problem. During the investigation, police had also discovered stolen items from Fawn's room in the home of one of the suspects. That discovery was enough to bring charges against all three. But here is where the case began to fall apart, quietly, piece by piece. The key witness in the prosecution recanted. They admitted they had not been truthful. Without that testimony holding everything together, the charges against the juvenile suspects were dropped. Then the DNA evidence came back, and it matched none of them. Not one of the three suspects could be connected to the biological evidence recovered at the scene. They were innocent, and the real killer was still out there. Now think about what this meant for Fawn's family. In the space of a few months, they had gone from losing their daughter and sister to thinking there was an answer, to watching that answer dissolve. The charges dropped. The suspects cleared. The case still open. The years started moving. KCPD detectives did not let the case die quietly. The initial investigators, by all accounts, had worked it hard. Every lead followed up, every possible witness spoken to. Captain Ben Caldwell, who would later supervise the cold case division, said of those early detectives, "They worked the case into the ground. They ran down everything they could find." But 1989 forensic technology had a ceiling. The crime scene evidence had been collected and stored, but in those early days, the most they could do with biological samples was compare blood types. That was it. Blood types. A tool as blunt as a hammer when what they needed was a scalpel. So the evidence went into storage, carefully preserved, waiting for science to catch up. In the first decade of the 2000s, technology finally gave detectives a new weapon. KCPD's crime lab scientists were able to develop a full DNA profile from the biological evidence that had been collected and stored from the original 1989 crime scene. A real DNA profile, not a blood type, not a partial match, but a complete genetic fingerprint of whoever had been in that room. They uploaded it to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the National Criminal Justice DNA database that holds profiles from convicted felons, arrestees, and crime scenes across the country. They waited. No match. Whoever had done this to Fawn Cox had never been in the CODIS system, never convicted of another crime that was registered there. The database came back empty, and the case remained unsolved. But the KCPD cold case section did not walk away. As recently as 2 years before the case was finally closed, detectives re-interviewed the former juvenile suspects, the ones who had been charged and cleared back in 1989. They got fresh DNA samples from them, just to be absolutely certain, just to rule out every possibility, once and for all. Those didn't match either. Meanwhile, Fawn's family was still living with the weight of it. Every holiday, every birthday, every year that passed without an answer. Her sister Amber Gonzalez, who had been just 1 year younger than Fawn at the time, never stopped hoping. She had always believed that the DNA evidence would eventually lead somewhere, that whoever had done this would eventually be found. And through all of it, through the arrests, the dropped charges, the failed CODIS searches, the re-interviews, the years, Donald Cox Jr. was living his life, attending family gatherings, sitting at the table, and no one knew. The summer of 2020 was unlike anything Kansas City had seen in decades. Violent crime had surged in the city. The headlines were relentless, and in response to that surge, the federal government launched Operation Legend, a program that pumped FBI resources, investigators, and money directly into local police departments across the country to help solve violent crimes. Kansas City was one of the cities selected. For the Fawn Cox case, this mattered in a very specific way. KCPD had always known that forensic genetic genealogy testing existed. They had watched it work in other cases, most famously in the Golden State Killer investigation in California, where investigators used a public genealogy database to identify a suspect who had evaded law enforcement for over 40 years. The technology worked. The KCPD knew it could work for Fawn's case. The problem was cost. Genetic genealogy testing is expensive. For a department like KCPD, which has to weigh every dollar against the needs of an entire city, it had been out of reach. They had the DNA, they had the profile, they just couldn't afford the test that might actually match it to a name. Operation Legend changed that. With federal resources now flowing into the department, the FBI stepped in and covered the cost of the testing. Parabon Nanolabs, one of the country's leading forensic genomics companies, the same firm that had worked on numerous high-profile cold cases, was brought in to run the analysis. Here is how genetic genealogy works, in plain terms. Scientists take the DNA recovered from a crime scene and compare it not just against criminal databases, but against the massive commercial genealogy databases that millions of ordinary people have uploaded their DNA to. Databases like GEDmatch, where people go to find their ancestors, their cousins, their family trees. The idea is this: even if the suspect's own DNA isn't in any criminal database, there's a good chance that a relative of theirs, a cousin, a sibling, a parent, has done a genealogy test for completely innocent reasons. And that relative's DNA leaves a trail that trained investigators can follow backward, like tracing a river to its source, building a family tree from the match outward until they narrow in on a specific individual. That is exactly what happened in Fawn Cox's case. The genetic genealogy test identified relatives of the killer through the genealogy database. From there, detectives built a family tree. They traced the branches. They followed the DNA upstream, and they arrived at a name: Donald Lee Cox Jr., Fawn's cousin, about 5 years older than her. Someone the family knew. Someone who had been to that house. Someone who would have known the layout of those rooms, the location of those windows, the rhythms of that family's home. But there was one more step before this was confirmed. Donald Cox Jr. was already dead. He had died in 2006, under circumstances that were initially suspicious enough to prompt a medical examiner's investigation. That investigation ultimately determined there was no foul play involved. But because a medical examiner had investigated his death, they had done what medical examiners do in those situations. They collected and preserved a blood sample. That blood sample had been sitting in storage for 14 years. KCPD's crime lab retrieved that sample. They extracted the DNA from it, and then they placed it alongside the DNA profile that had been recovered from Fawn's bedroom in 1989. 100% match. 31 years. 3 wrong suspects cleared. A killer who died before he was ever charged. And now, finally, an answer. The case was closed. On November 10, 2020, 31 years, 3 months, and 15 days after Fawn Marie Cox was killed in her own bedroom, detectives from the Kansas City Police Department sat down with her family and told them the truth. They had a name. Fawn's mother, Beverly, was still alive. Her father was still alive. Both of them had carried this for more than 3 decades. The grief of losing a child, layered with the particular torment of never knowing who was responsible. Both of them, according to Captain Ben Caldwell, were sad but relieved when they heard the news. And then Captain Caldwell said something that stops you cold. He said the family had sometimes wondered whether the cousin had been responsible. They had wondered. Think about what it means to carry that, to sit across from someone at a family gathering, year after year, and feel something you couldn't name, some instinct you couldn't justify, some shadow that passed over you when he was in the room, and to have no proof, and to try to push it aside, and to keep living. Donald Cox Jr. died in 2006. He was never charged. He never sat in a courtroom. He never had to look at Fawn's family and answer for what he did. By the time the science caught up to him, he had been dead for 14 years. That is one of the hardest things about this case. The resolution is real. The science is solid. The truth is known. But there is no courtroom justice here. There is no sentencing. There is no day where the family watches a verdict delivered and feels that specific kind of closure that comes from a public accounting. What they have instead is the truth. And for Fawn's sister, Felisa Cox, that matters. It's a relief, she said when the news broke. There's closure. The answers aren't always what we were asking for, but there's closure. Read that again slowly. The answers aren't always what we were asking for. She wasn't asking for this answer. She was asking for her sister back. She was asking for the life Fawn didn't get to live. She was asking for the years the family spent not knowing. No answer changes any of that. But the truth, the actual confirmed DNA-backed truth, does something. It names the thing. It gives the shadow a shape. Fawn's sister Amber Gonzalez had said, years before the case was solved, that Fawn had been her protector. She stood up for me, Amber said. Fawn Cox, 16 years old, working a summer job at an amusement park to help her family, had been the kind of person who looked after her younger sister, who took care of people, the kind of person who deserved to be protected. This case matters for more than just the Cox family. It is the first murder case in the history of the Kansas City Police Department solved through forensic genetic genealogy. It proved that the technology works. That evidence stored properly for 30 years can still be the key that opens everything. That a killer who believes they escaped, who dies believing they escaped, can still be named. Captain Caldwell said it carefully but clearly. Not every cold case is a good candidate for genetic genealogy testing. But when the conditions are right, he said, it could be a tremendous tool. It has already been used in dozens of other cold cases since the Golden State Killer was identified in 2018, and it will be used in dozens more. Because here is what genetic genealogy does that changes everything. It does not require the killer to be in any criminal database. It only requires one of their relatives to have been curious enough about their family history to spit in a tube and send it to a genealogy company. That is the thing Donald Cox Jr. couldn't have known. He didn't know that 31 years later, his own DNA would be traced through a relative's ancestry test. He didn't know that a blood sample taken from his body after his death in 2006 would eventually be placed next to a sample from 1989 and found to be an exact match. He thought he had gotten away with it. He hadn't. Fawn Cox was 16 years old. She worked at Worlds of Fun to help support her family. She came home from a late shift, went to bed because she had to be up early, and she never woke up. She deserved more years, more summers, more noise and mess and ordinary life. What she got instead was 31 years of her family carrying her name forward, refusing to let her become just a number in a file, until the science finally caught up to the man who took her from them. If you're new to this channel, this is what we do here at Crime Relics. We tell these stories because the people inside them deserve to be remembered, not as cases, not as headlines, but as human beings who had people who loved them and names worth knowing. Fawn Marie Cox. Say her name.